Hey everybody, Kit Merker here from Noble9, and I'm with Bink Naughton. She is a principal PM in SRE at Microsoft, and she's here to talk about reliability stuff.
Hi, Kit. Hello, everybody.
When you think about capacity planning and managing the cost of infrastructure relative to achieving reliability.
Given doing this for a while and having done it on the small scale to the large scale, one of the things that you look at over time is that infrastructure tends to get built usually larger than what you wind up using. And there's a constant eye on the bottom line. And so you have this regular back and forth tension about how well am I using what I'm using, and do I need more, and when do I need more? It also leads into the conversation about, okay, how reliable does it need to be? Because that's going to be your cost multiplier for how much you need to put into this in order to get the reliability results that you're looking for. The first step that most organizations that I've worked with have gone through is this: how much is this worth to me? And realistically, how much is it going to cost me to get it? In modern context and a cloud context, those numbers are pretty clear. When teams are doing it more on their own, that becomes a lot harder. And so basically that first sort of discovery exercise and sitting down and having a cogent conversation about what you actually need versus what you think you need is the first step of the dialogue to really get that right. And the interesting part about it is it also ties with opportunity. The more efficient you are as you go along, and the more intentional you are in how you plan and scale, the better positioned you are to kind of accommodate things as they come up. It's the internet, right? I mean, fundamentally, things are going to happen that you don't expect, both opportunities and problems. So you want to be in a position where you can think about how to take best advantage of what you got in front of you, because that creates opportunities.
Putting this question into a current context, you have a lot of organizations with economic uncertainty that are dealing with remote work and kind of new digital experiences that they're having to put in place to connect with customers. And I know there's a lot of people who are concerned with costs, that managing costs and managing the risk, right, of their services, meanwhile having to maintain customer delight, or at least customer non-hatred, let's say. How do you balance that? What do you do to make sure that, or what's your advice to people who are concerned about the cost of infrastructure right now, maybe in a cloud context, as they're trying to deal with uncertainty in front of them?
Your cost is not just going to be your infrastructure, right? Your infrastructure, however, is a cost you need to consider in light of those other factors. So if you're looking at, okay, where is my money going, and am I getting out of it what I expect, relative to the overall set of things that you're maintaining in order to keep your customers happy, that's the first question. You can throw more money at something from an infrastructure perspective, but unless you know that it solves the problem that you need to solve, that's not really going to give you the benefit that you're expecting. And it gets down to understanding what the problem is, and unpacking how best your situation, your context, can take advantage of what's out there on offer. I'm not a proponent of one particular solution. You won't see me going out and set up redundancy honestly, for a lot of things, the kind of redundancy you need to engineer into how your products work in order to keep your customers happy will vary based on where the weak spots in your architecture are. All right. So making a lump assumption that you must absolutely have a certain level of nines for every piece of it is going to create a situation where you're putting more money onto the physical side that might be better used elsewhere.
How do you sort of back into the right number of nines? I've heard some people use this idea that, hey, there's a cost of downtime. You multiply that by the, minutes per year, and, bada bing, bada boom, you have your sort of reliability budget. Is it that simple, or is there more nuance to it?
Those aren't bad for guardrails, but that's kind of, if that's the only way you're looking at the problem, you're going to have a lot of slop in there. I think the approach there is actually using right, wrong, or indifferent. Most organizations have a history of where they've had problems, right? So I'm not a big fan of sort of deep introspection on every single thing that happened in the past. but the trends, the patterns that you notice, and looking at the balance between patterns and practices, and then how your tools are set up to kind of influence the right behavior. Those pieces, in the concert of the different components that make up your architecture, those pieces will get you better engineered and closer to what you need to be. Because let's be honest, right? You can, especially in a cloud context, you're looking at your providers. Everybody knows about, the fiber seeking harbor tug, or the shark, the fiber eating shark. There are steps that you take to manage for that, but those are fairly high level and they're fairly straightforward at the beginning, right? After that, the real nuances in how your service performs and how reliable it is are about how the different pieces interact and what happens in your normal course of operations. Those bits aren't rocket science, and they are about time and attention in the right place against the right measurements, rather than being heavily swayed by, okay, this is how much it costs us to be down. Now, I will say, measuring where the different categories of your downtime come from helps you prioritize where to spend attention. Look at it from the perspective of, okay, if you have something in your core infrastructure that habitually brings down 70% of your services, you're gonna spend more time to make sure that's buttressed up than you would on something that impacts 2 services, maybe half an hour a year.
If your production system is constantly changing because you're making updates and you've got, software delivery happening, which is, maybe every, day or multiple times a day, you've got changes in your infrastructure, it kind of changes your risk profile as well. How do you deal with that?
There's a maturity model discussion in there, hiding in there. But I think the net message is, if you are paying attention to managing your changes in an incremental way, and you are being studied about your ability to roll forward, roll back, and understand impact, then you're going to have change at a level that you can react appropriately and know what is likely to be your concern. There's, side topic here, potentially. There's a frequent tension about rolling things out and then diagnosing before you roll back. So you're diagnosing in production. That one always raises my eyebrows. But the principles of being able to roll your changes continuously, that's how you keep up, and that's how you stay agile for your customer requirements, as well as fixing problems that come up as you learn from what's out there. So you kind of have to, but you want to do it in a intentional way.
So on that topic of rollouts, are you suggesting that perhaps it's better to, first stop the bleeding and kind of try to roll back or try to get into a known good state before diagnostic? Or you're saying that it depends, or use other kind of incremental releases? Yeah.
It depends, right? There are very often cases where the packaging of the change that you want to do, and by packaging, I mean how you partition which pieces you roll and when, okay? That will give you other opportunities to look at this, but it sort of depends, like, have you built that into your your release strategy and your product architecture so that you can do those things? That you don't always have that choice, okay? And the more complex the environment is, the more interacting components that you've got to worry about, the harder it can be to reliably test those things in production at scale to really surface problems. So that's it depends. But I think the reality is that a lot of organizations steer away from more complex implementation at that level because they feel like it's going to slow them down and create a lot of friction. My contention is it actually speeds you up over time. Because if you're running around trying to respond in fire drill mode to something that is surfaced and impacted critical customers, that's a lot of energy burn. That's a lot of resource burn compared to the more intentional sit back and dial in how you want to do your changes in a way so that you can minimize impact. And you want to take your infrastructure, your physical infrastructure, your network infrastructure, those are broad strokes, right? You want to put them to one side and get them dealt with and done and not have to go back to look at it again. Other than, okay, we've got a new market we need to go into.
You weren't always a in the software game. You weren't always in reliability engineering. You mentioned something, I think, beforehand about the human genome. Maybe you can share some stories, some old school war stories about how you got into this game.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting place to find myself after 20 some years. I'm got my degree in molecular biology. I wanted to be out there helping to cure cancer. The timing was fortuitous. I got into working for a company that was doing effectively early data mining and learning on human genome data. We were doing a lot of gene sequencing and working against a lot of publicly available data sources. Some people may be familiar with an article called How Pearl Saved the Human Genome Project. That was the era of a lot of organizations moving to build their own compute clusters out of white box Linux servers. And the more time I spent in that space, the more time I spent working with various system architects, system engineers, the more I got into large scale distributed computing. And that eventually led me to Google, which, yeah, large infrastructure. I found out I'm a large infrastructure nerd.
How do you feel about wasted resources?
So for me, wasted resource is wasted opportunity. You have a consistent environment in which you need to be able to make sure everything is configured, is maintained, is up to current state, and is operating the way it should be. And when you are wasting resources, you have a situation where one of a couple of things has happened. You are not keeping something up to date. You are adding unnecessary resource into an environment, i.e. unnecessarily expanding and creating more surface area to be managed because you're not using what you have effectively. Or you're exerting an opportunity, you're creating opportunity cost because you're using resources inappropriately that somebody else could be using, which is often the case in a shared resource environment. That is something that's easy to forget in a cloud. Because cloud for everybody is the sort of thing that it just kind of feels readily available. But as case in point right now, a lot of organizations have problems with the supply chain because of COVID. And so everybody's expectations about what capacity will be available and when are up for some level of discussion because, a case in point, it took me, 6 weeks to get a new motherboard to build a machine for home, when normally it would have taken me about 3 days. So just because I, as a home consumer in that case, am having problems doesn't mean that the rest of the environment that builds capacity escapes. And sometimes the fastest way to liberate capacity is when you are looking at what you already have and saying, am I using it right? And am I actually using it? That was a problem even when the servers were in a closet down the hall. It's very much a problem now. You can't understanding and having a tangible understanding of just how much stuff is allocated to you. That's tough, right? And so what you see is the finance department is the one who's more worried about how well you're using what you've got than most teams who are directly accountable for their equipment.
On that topic about sort of the finance issue and maybe thinking about organizations, and we all know that organizations can be dysfunctional, and even the best organizations have their pathologies. But when you think about the different stakeholders, and one I think is particularly interesting is kind of the business stakeholders versus the technical stakeholders. You have a group of people who are worried about running a business, and there are very sort of a few very high level concerns about are we making money? Are we protecting ourselves? Are we helping customers? Are we cost efficient? And then you have the engineering side, which has the task of kind of justifying the infrastructure and delivering on those expectations. Have you witnessed a good set of conversations between those different factions, and how should that work? And what's your experience been with that? How should we have a great conversation within business and technical about reliability and cost efficiency?
So the art of that discussion, and it is a dialogue. It is not a one-stop shop, unless they really are not, they just want somebody else to take care of it, which does happen. The art of that conversation is around painting a realistic picture of what your options are and what your trade-offs are. I've been in a couple of situations where the most viable approach that executive leadership has been able to provide is basically saying, look, here's what it costs us to get this wrong in delaying the decision, right? So I may have mentioned opportunity cost earlier. Opportunity cost is the thing in most cases, especially in the tech environment, where you wind up burning unexpectedly large amounts of money. Because being able to respond is more important than being able to respond perfectly or with absolute efficiency. And so basically the dialogue around what options exist, how the vectors that you're playing with in terms of the decisions balance out. I mean, that's more important, honestly, and understanding what that is than the actual dollar figures. And I'm not saying the dollars aren't important, because many organizations find themselves, like I have X much money to spend. Okay. And that's a very hard constraint, and it's real. But you will necessarily dial back what you need to do if that is your situation. What you want to be having is the conversation about the relative value of these things, because then you can understand how to employ the options you have available.
Your point about opportunity cost, I think, is so spot on, because my experience as as somebody who's trying to grow businesses or run new products, right, and trying to drive adoption, that often, I think this is your point, is that delaying a decision can be the most frustrating, and in some ways the most expensive and the riskiest move, beyond getting it sort of, not right, but at least making progress, right? This is what you're getting at. Yeah. And you can't do that. You can't address opportunity cost reactively, in a way, right? You have to be thinking about opportunity cost kind of all the time and looking for it. Would you agree?
Correct. Everyone's contributions to the decision-making process are important. If you are taking a diverse and inclusive approach, and I don't mean from sort of protected classes perspective, I literally mean from recognizing what it means to the various aspects of the business in order to follow a particular course, and being candid about what those costs are, because they will net out into some dollar figure at some point. That's a function of how the system works, right? So you need to understand what your system dynamics are and how those interchanges work, or at least what the teams agree is the right way to make those calls. And that informs how you then use the inputs to figure out what the right option is for you at a given point in time. I would love to say it's easy, and certainly if you have a really constrained budget, yeah, that's going to put some serious constraints on what you can do. But it's usually more than that, to have the right conversation.
Could a counter argument to what you just said, a counter argument might be, well, reducing everything down to dollars is maybe missing, it may be kind of a reductionist view, and bean counting, right? Engineering by bean counting, in a way, right? And especially if you're in a innovation kind of situation, you're trying to build a new product, you're trying to address a new market, you're trying to grow. Couldn't an argument be that focusing too much on cost is actually counterproductive from an entrepreneurial perspective of getting your product to market and making mistakes and iterating? How would you address that counter argument?
I don't think it's a counter argument. I'm actually in agreement, right? The principle of understanding what it costs doesn't mean you don't spend, right? This doesn't happen without expenditure of some kind. It'll either be people resource or it'll be time passed while you're making something happen, or it will be CapEx, right? Or you can't avoid spending money with this. It doesn't come for free. Unless you're in a big organization that has a lot of pockets of wasted resource that you know how to lay your hands on. And I've been there. But but the reality,
beg, borrow, and steal kind of infrastructure, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
But also literally consulting engineering in order to be able to say, hey, if I can liberate for you about 20% of your load on those servers, can we beg some time on system? Okay. And I'm not talking back in mainframe days, which is, you know, for some of your audience may go back that far. But the reality is that in a lot of large scale data analytics systems, you will find that frequently. There's negotiation that goes back and forth because if you want to run an experiment, that's a fundamentally different exercise than committed resource for regular infrastructure. Okay, and you need to think through that and through that scenario and how it influences the portfolio of resource and how your resources are used. So it always, in some ways, comes down to dollars. The question is, which is more important?
If you want to give just one piece of advice to CEOs, CTOs, executives that are struggling with balancing the competing interests of reliability and cost management, what's like the one thing they should go out and do?
Know where your resources are going. You can demand things, but you won't actually understand the impact of the choices you're asking your teams to make.
It's kind of like the, if you want to lose weight, write down everything you eat kind of methodology.
Correct. Yeah.
Bink, this is an amazing, fascinating conversation. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time today.
You're very welcome, Kit. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And everybody out there, this is Kit Merker from Noble 9 signing off.